March 23, 1945, West Bank of the Rhine. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the German defense, watched the river in the pale light of dawn. His doctrine was clear. If the enemy wanted to cross, he would have to build bridges, and they would not be allowed. On his map, the Rhine was still impassable. This certainty, cultivated by generations of strategists, was about to be dissolved by a vehicle that the Germans classified as half truck, half joke. The DUKW, called Duck by the Americans, was not armored, it was not fast, nor did it impress, but he swam, and that, in practice, destroyed what hundreds of anti-tank batteries could not defend. What follows is the account of a crossing that was never foreseen, carried out by an army that exchanged bridges for amphibious wheels, an operation where victory did not come by cannons, but by motorized logistics. The Germans were waiting for barges. They received trucks that drove over the water. The doctrine collapsed. The Rhine was crossed not from above but from within, and what the defenders called the sacred line, America treated as a technical obstacle. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any speech. In just 72 hours, the Americans made more than 5,000 crossings of the Rhine, using vehicles that German doctrine did not even recognize as a threat. It transported 15,000 troops, 3,000 tons of ammunition and supplies, and more than 1,200 vehicles, all without building a single bridge. The Reich's final line of defense was not crushed by tanks, but ignored by floating trucks. If you value accurately told history, based on logistics, numbers, and forgotten facts, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps this channel continue to reveal the details that changed the war, even when no one saw them coming. For Germany, the Rhine was more than a river. It was a symbol, a liquid wall, a line that separated the heart of the Reich from the invasion. Since Julius Caesar, crossing the Rhine has meant challenging the impossible. The military doctrine of the Wehrmacht absorbed this mystique as dogma. Any army that wanted to cross it would have to follow a rigid sequence: reconnaissance, building pontoon bridges, establishing a bridgehead, and only then, advancing mechanized divisions. It was a disciplined model, based on precision engineering and the belief that time worked against the invader. In 1945, this belief became a sentence. Internal documents reveal how the German High Command structured its defense based on maps of previous crossings and simulations that considered only two scenarios: blown bridges or sunken barges. The DUKW did not appear in any of them. German engineers, trained to respond to slow, channeled crossings, were ready to destroy physical structures. But what to do when the structure did not exist? When did the crossing leave no trace? Germany's technical superiority was based on control, of geography, of time, of sequence. Against a vehicle that dispensed with all this, there was no doctrine that could resist. In a February 1945 report, an artillery commander positioning batteries along the Rhine wrote, "We waited for the sound of stakes and cables. When we hear wood and steel, we will know where to aim." That sound never came. Instead, came the muffled rumble of 6 cylinders sailing under line of sight. For the Wehrmacht, it was invisible. A truck didn't cross a river, logic said so. But DUKW didn't need German logic to work. He only needed water and fuel. The mistake was not only technical, it was doctrinaire. Germany expected an attack that would mimic its own methods, its own discipline, and like all doctrine based on mirrors, it failed in the face of what it did not recognize. The Rhine River was the frontier of predictability, and so it became vulnerable to the unpredictable. The line of defense was built with concrete blocks, fixed guns, and sequential counterattack plans. There was intelligence, engineering, and intention there. Only one thing was missing: imagination. On the American side, the war was already operating in another paradigm. The DUKW represented this perfectly. Improvisation, mobility, fluidity. A truck capable of driving from the factory to the battlefield, crossing roads, mud, and rivers without asking permission from the doctrine. It was not about individual genius, but about scale. American production of amphibious vehicles exceeded Germany's by more than 40 times. While Berlin struggled to build a prototype, Detroit had already dispatched thousands. In 1944, the United States produced, per month, the equivalent of 3 years of German manufacture in military trucks. This data is ignored in many history books. But for those who understand logistics, it's the line between victory and defeat. If this statistic surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because that's what happened on the Rhine. A victory with no armor, no tactical acrobatics, just trucks doing what they were designed to do. Get from point A to point B, even though point B was on the other side of the myth. Testimonies of German prisoners collected after the crossing reveal incredulity. An officer from the 7th Panzer Division stated, "We searched for bridges all night, then by engineers. We didn't find any. In the morning, they were already behind us." It was not just a tactical surprise. It was the collapse of an operational faith. What the Germans saw was something that their doctrine had denied, and that therefore they did not know how to combat. The natural fortress, which for centuries had been seen as the last bastion, had been overtaken as if it were a puddle, and this was only possible because the DUKW did not behave like a tank, nor like a boat. It behaved like a factory on wheels, sailing. And when a factory sails, war ceases to be combat and becomes delivery. Delivery of men, ammunition, fuel, hot coffee, radio, light artillery, intelligence on the move. The Rhine became, ironically, a supply conduit. What the Germans called a barrier, the Americans turned into a trail. But to understand how this misjudgment became so deeply rooted in German doctrine, one must take a closer look at what the Reich intelligence really knew, or chose not to see. And that will be the focus of the next part. Because Germany saw the DUKW, but he decided to laugh. Between November 1944 and March 1945, the German High Command produced more than 800 reports on Allied logistical movements. Only 3 of them mention, vaguely and disparagingly, the presence of light amphibious vehicles used by the Americans. At no time is the name DUKW mentioned seriously, and yet it was already operating in Anzio, Provence, the Seine, the Loire, and the Moselle, always fulfilling the same function, delivering. For German military intelligence, the DUKW was a whim, an excess of American industry, manufactured to impress journalists, not to threaten combatants, a truck that floated, a trick, not a doctrine. The error was not only in the absence of data, but in the biased interpretation of this data. Intelligence analysts, trained in the Prussian tradition, evaluated enemy machines according to criteria of robustness, armor, fire autonomy, and direct tactical value. DUKW failed in all of them. It was not armored. He had no fixed weaponry, nor was he part of heavy formations. The conclusion was simple, irrelevant. But this reading was more than technical. It was ideological, a direct reflection of the structural arrogance of the Third Reich in the face of American industrial culture. The German soldier was the pinnacle of discipline. The American, according to the pamphlets distributed in the battalions, was lazy, consumerist, dependent on absurd supplies. The inside jokes among intelligence officers spoke of Coca-Cola armies, bubblegum battalions, and in the deserts of North Africa, even ice cream refrigerator cars. When the DUKW appeared in the first reports from northern France, it was automatically associated with the same line of reasoning. One more futile invention, one more industrial distraction. German doctrine saw American industry as an excess, not a force, a waste of resources, not a multiplier advantage. Instead of seeing the ability to produce modular solutions on a large scale, the Reich's intelligence saw disorder, noise, and propaganda. And so he blinded himself to the efficiency that disguised itself as abundance. The DUKW was exactly that, a humble machine, with ridiculous aesthetics, but functional. He didn't bully because he didn't seem dangerous. It was just another cog in a system that the Germans refused to understand. War as automated logistics. The very term DUKW seemed like a joke, a technical acronym converted into a childish nickname. To the German soldiers, when they first saw it on the Seine, it looked like a duck crossing the river, and so it was, the Allied ducks. But in March 1945, those ducks returned, and they were no longer bringing mail bags. They were carrying ammunition, riflemen, and grenades, in silence, in volume, at a factory pace. The failure of German intelligence was actually a reflection of its cultural rigidity. Germany admired the lone engineer, the precision designer, the unique and invincible tank. The DUKW, on the other hand, was the fruit of another spirit, that of collective engineering, of rapid production, of immediate functionality. It was designed by a civilian shipyard, fitted into truck shops, and put into production by General Motors in less than 2 months. There was no individual genius. There was systemic integration. The Germans expected art. They received efficiency, and the warnings came. In January 1945, a British intercept revealed movements of amphibious units in the sector of the 21st Army Group. The document was shared with the German Rhine Command, but was labeled as Coastal Drive. It was not imagined that vehicles of this type would be used in inland rivers. The belief was that in order to cross the Rhine, it would be necessary to rebuild bridges. For this, the Allies would take days. The Germans calculated a window of 72 hours between the beginning of the crossing and the construction of the first permanent connections. That window would be crushed by the panzers. But when DUKWs started entering the water, that window simply didn't exist. The German surprise was so great that in the 15th Army situation reports, the officers wrote the phrase, "The crossing does not seem to obey traditional logic. There are indications that individual vehicles are using the Rhine itself as a road." A division commander reported in the field, "We were ready to destroy a bridge, but the trucks passed through the water, no bridge, no noise, no warning. They just crossed over." This type of testimony opens up the abyss between what intelligence believed and what was actually in front of their eyes. But if Germany ignored the DUKW, how was it born? And why did a vehicle considered only an appendage of the beaches end up becoming the key to crossing the greatest natural obstacle on the Western Front? That answer is in the next part, and it starts with a beaching off the American coast. In June 1942, a supply vessel ran aground off the rocky coast of Massachusetts during a routine exercise. The strong tide prevented direct access to the ship, and trucks in the port could not cross the strip of water. The cargo was stuck. The incident, irrelevant in the eyes of any general, generated a disconcertingly simple question for the U.S. Army. What if the truck could swim? It was not a futuristic ambition or an experimental project, but a real logistical problem. Every day even. The answer would come in less than 38 days. General Motors, in partnership with marine and civil engineers from the Office of Scientific Research and Development, has designed a vehicle based on the existing 2.5-ton GMC CCKW truck. They sealed it, installed a steel hull, placed a propeller attached to the drivetrain, and assembled a rudder. The first prototype of the DUKW was ready. It wasn't pretty, it was not elegant, but it floated, drove, and carried up to 2 tons of payload without needing ports, ramps, or cranes. It was the embodiment of a recurring American idea, solving a practical problem with a replicable solution. There was no beauty. There was purpose. The acronym DUKW came from General Motors' internal code, D for the year 1942, U for the utility chassis, K for rear-wheel drive, and W for rear twin-axle. But the pronunciation DUK imposed itself naturally, as if the name had already been born ready. The Army quickly realized the tactical value of this aberration, and more importantly, realized that it could be produced at scale. Each unit took only a few weeks to build. It was light enough to be hoisted by naval cranes, narrow enough to run on the streets of European villages, and reliable enough to work in salt, mud, snow, and rushing scenarios. In the following months, it was tested in Anzio, in Salerno, in Dieppe, and mainly on the beaches of Normandy. There, the DUKWs demonstrated something more precious than versatility: logistical autonomy. With them, troops did not have to wait for ports or infrastructure. The cargo came from the water straight to the battlefield. Germany, by contrast, relied on organized ports, intact railroads, and heavy trucks that bogged down easily. The DUKW was the opposite of this fragility, a movable link between the sea and the road. And its greatest advantage was not tactical, it was industrial. By 1943, production of DUKWs reached 2,000 units per month. By the end of the war, more than 21,000 had been manufactured, none of them designed for direct combat, all destined to transport what actually wins wars: supply, communication, men. The American philosophy was clear. It was not a question of creating a super machine, but a sufficient machine, one that could be mass-made, operated by any soldier, and sent to any front. It was a paradigm shift. While Germany invested in monumental machines like the King Tiger, a tank that needed 5 men and a reinforced bridge to move, The United States produced a truck that single-handedly crossed rivers, got off the barge, waded into the mud, and delivered ammunition before the coffee cooled. And each duck cost 10% of the value of a German medium tank. This was not industrial romanticism. It was the logic of modern warfare. General Motors engineers were not interested in impressing the high command. They were interested in efficiency. The DUKW was made with the same engine as civilian trucks, the same electrical system as existing vehicles, and even the same wheels. This facilitated field repair, operator training, and parts replacement. It was the antithesis of the German obsession with unique and irreplaceable projects. The DUKW could be series assembled, maintained in the field, and operated in any environment. Instead of enchanting with cutting-edge technology, he won by the sum of small functional decisions. And that philosophy, repeated thousands of times in American factories, made the duck not only viable, but decisive. Even so, until 1945, the Germans continued to ignore its strategic potential. They considered it a coastal landing resource, useful only on the beaches of France or on the shores of Italian lakes. There was no assumption in German intelligence reports that the DUKW could be used on wide, fast-moving rivers like the Rhine. Such negligence would be costly. Because Americans didn't see the duck as a vehicle, they saw it as a concept, a mobility multiplier, capable of eliminating entire stages of conventional doctrine. And when the Rhine appeared on the horizon, the American question was not, how are we going to cross this? But rather, how many DUKWs fit in this crossing? But duck by itself would not change the course of the war. He needed doctrine, from trained operators, of a supply network that spoke their language, that of mobile logistics. This doctrine was born far from the Rhine, on the beaches, on the canals, and in the makeshift training grounds. And that's exactly what will be revealed in the next part. How the United States quietly created an invisible army of drivers, navigators, and mechanics who would turn the DUKW into a weapon of doctrinal disruption. War teaches fast. At Salerno, DUKWs were used to land ammunition. In Anzio, they brought wounded under fire. In Omaha, they handed out radios while fighting was still raging on the sand. But in all of these episodes, her role was a supporting role, logistical support, never the front line. This reinforced the German impression that they were secondary vehicles, almost irrelevant in real combat. But while the generals of the Reich ignored the ducks on the other side of the English Channel, a quiet doctrine was taking shape. In 1944, on the banks of the Maas River in the interior of the Netherlands, specialized units began training in a new type of operation, river crossings with amphibious vehicles under indirect fire, without the use of bridges or towed barges. It was the birth of the amphibious truck companies, entire companies made up of DUKWs, trained drivers, field mechanics, radio operators, and river navigation guides. These units weren't just formed. They were coordinated with infantry, combat engineering, and air support units. The DUKW ceased to be a floating truck and became the link in a chain of maneuvering, allowing entire divisions to move through water at road speed. This doctrine was born in the Pacific, where Americans faced hundreds of islands, narrow beaches, and a total lack of infrastructure. There, crossing was the norm, and DUKW, a necessity. But it was in Europe that the doctrine became more sophisticated, because in the fields and rivers of the continent, the Allies discovered that natural obstacles could be overcome, not by heroism, but by planning. Training on the Maas included night crossings, compass navigation in fog, shipments under simulated pressure, and synchronization with saturation bombardments. Within a few months, more than 2,500 drivers and crew had been qualified to operate DUKWs in combat conditions. The doctrine even provided for contingencies for the loss of vehicles. Each company had reserves, spare parts, and mobile workshops that moved along with the front. It was an amphibious operation, without depending on the sea. Germany did not notice any of this. For the Reich, river warfare was a specialty of heavy engineering, building bridges, launching boats, establishing bridgeheads, consolidating banks. The idea that a truck could enter the water, drive to the other shore, and deliver ammunition directly to the point of contact was simply not part of the German doctrinal imagination. And this blindness had a strategic cost, because while they were preparing their artillery to hold bridges, The Allies were training not to need them. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but it was too simple to be taken seriously. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts in this depth, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more stories buried in the dust of military logistics. British internal reports from November 1944 show that the 79th Armored Division began to integrate its actions with companies of DUKWs, providing for simultaneous crossings on secondary rivers. This gave rise to joint exercises where tanks used movable bridges, while infantry and supplies came by water. Mobility became three-dimensional: road, bridge, and river. And at the heart of this mobility operated the DUKWs, discreet, numerous, ruthless. While the eyes of the enemy searched for tanks, the ducks swam. But the success of this doctrine depended on one last element: the ability to coordinate everything in the field. Because in March 1945, when the Rhine appeared before the Allied troops, it was not enough to have vehicles. It was necessary to have a plan. And this plan began to be drawn in secret, weeks before the first wheel touched the water. The next part reveals how the United States prepared the largest river operation of the war without the Germans noticing, and how the crossing of the Rhine would be just the first move in a logistical breakdown. The east bank of the Rhine on the morning of March 24, 1945, was a spectacle of discipline and engineering. The Wehrmacht had turned that stretch of river into a modern wall. 3,000 bunkers were active, arranged along almost 200 kilometers of defensive length. In reinforced caves, artillery units awaited instructions. In the occupied villages, 200,000 civilians were mobilized to dig trenches, set up barricades, and assist in the transport of ammunition. Everything followed a detailed plan. The Allies would attack in 3 stages: initial sounding, bridge building, and mechanized advance. German doctrine relied on time. If the construction of the bridges took at least 48 hours, it would be enough time to reposition the panzer divisions and crush the bridgehead before it gained depth. It was a logical bet, based on decades of conventional warfare, but it was a logic made for tanks, bridges, and barges, not for amphibious trucks. What began to appear on the horizon, silently, confused even the most experienced radio operators. There were no signs of heavy engineering, no metallic construction noise, no crackling of structures being hoisted. There was only movement, constant fluid coming straight from the water. The first messages intercepted that morning reveal the shock. A communications officer of the 11th Division reported, enemy mechanized units were seen, but without a visible bridge. The crossing is taking place by unidentified means. A minute later, another operator adds, I request confirmation. Has the Rhine been crossed? Does the river remain there? The answer did not come. And it did not come because the German doctrine had no room for that reality. The DUKWs would emerge straight out of the fog, crossing the river in groups of 5 or 6, unloading men and supplies, returning to the point of origin and repeating the operation. Each vehicle carried 2 to 3 soldiers plus weapons, fuel, and radios. It was not a breaking attack. It was a logistical trickle, continuous, uninterrupted, impossible to intercept with the classic logic of defense. The Wehrmacht's mistake was twofold: technical and philosophical. Technically, they expected a military symphony, that precise sequence of tactical phases that allowed them to anticipate the enemy's every move. But they faced something different: a floating assembly line. The Americans did not operate in rhythm, but in simultaneity. While one wave disembarked, another was already preparing to enter the river. And because the DUKWs dispensed with physical structures, the German artillery had no fixed targets. The guns were calibrated for bridges, not for isolated vehicles. And even when they did, the damage was minimal. A stray DUKW did not delay the operation. Simply, another took his place. Philosophically, German doctrine did not conceive of war as a flow. It saw it as territory, a space to be defended by layers, lines, points of resistance. The crossing of the Rhine was therefore the last time when this model could work, and he failed. General Blaskowitz, commander of Army Group H, noted in his diary, "We expected bridges. We receive what they call water trucks. Intelligence predicted 48 hours. They crossed in 8. What Germany saw that night was not an invasion. It was a breakdown of rhythm. Time, so essential for the counteroffensive, was devoured by enemy logistics. The Panzer reserves, stationed 60 kilometers from the Rhine line, were ready to move at the first sign of a traditional crossing. But the absence of clear targets caused hesitation. They were waiting for a bridge to blow up, a convoy to ambush, a bridgehead to encircle. None of this happened. Instead, they received reports of trucks going in and out of the water without ceasing. In less than 12 hours, the first American units were within 5 kilometers of the east bank, with radios operating, light artillery in position, and supplies secured. There was no breach. There was no pause. Just movement. The irony, brutal and precise, is that the defense of the Rhine was one of the most complete works of German military engineering since the Siegfried Line. It was the end of the line, the ultimate shield. But that shield was circumvented by something that German reports derisively called a duck with wheels. This phrase, recorded in a report by the 74th Corps, sums up the unpreparedness well. What looked like a duck crossed the Rhine at 3:17 a.m., initially considered as a reconnaissance vessel. By 4 a.m., more than 20 similar units had crossed. What did not seem dangerous became unavoidable. But DUKW did not act alone. Behind it was a coordination system that operated like an invisible machine, with operators, caterers, scouts, and cartographers working in absolute synchronism. The next part will reveal how this gear was assembled, how it worked in real time, and why the Germans didn't just see vehicles, but an entire chain of war in motion. In the dense darkness of the night of March 23, 1945 at 9 p.m. sharp, the first DUKWs began to move. Engines running in tactical silence, headlights covered, radio encoded channel. Inside each vehicle, 12 men, Marines from the 89th Infantry Division, sat in absolute silence. Each carried his full equipment: M1 rifles, ammunition, grenades, field radios, and light mortars. Outside, the Rhine flowed as it always had, wide, dense, fast. For the German doctrine, insurmountable. But Americans did not see a river. They saw a path. Every 2 minutes, a new DUKW would slide into the water, followed by another, and then another. There was no break. It was a programmed flow, ordered like a production line. In all, more than 300 vehicles crossed in the first 6 hours, creating a living beachhead which expanded and self-supplied in real time. And the most impressive, without needing a return, the DUKWs would move forward, land the men, and if they weren't destroyed, load new supplies on the other side, as if the Rhine were a one-way road to war. From a tactical point of view, the effect was devastating. The German defenders, positioned to react to a bridge construction, were caught out of position. The bunkers stared into the void, waiting for fixed targets that would never appear. The observation lines, trained to identify mechanized columns, saw only lights flashing in the water and nondescript shapes emerging from the bank. The first German machine guns opened fire at 9:14 p.m., but there was nowhere to aim. The DUKWs approached at scattered angles without rigid formation, taking advantage of the geography and shadows of the night. By 10 p.m., the Americans had established 3 landing zones with mortar cover, and before midnight, entire units were more than a mile from the eastern bank, digging in defensive positions and assembling light artillery brought in by the ducks themselves. All without a bridge, without a pause, without exposure. The turning point came when German radio operators, seeking to identify the crossing point, realized that there was no fixed point. The messages began to contradict each other. A detachment to the north said that the crossing came from the central sector. Another, further south, reported vehicles appearing where no previous movement had been seen. The confusion was total. The Rhine, hitherto treated as the absolute limit of maneuver, had become permeable, liquid, a real-time supply channel. An officer from the 47th Grenadier Division reported, "They don't build, they just arrive. It's as if the river were theirs." Era. Each DUKW could carry up to 2,500 kilos. This included men, ammunition, radios, supporting armament, and fuel. The first 100 vehicles carried more than 1,200 soldiers, 30 machine guns, 14 mortars, and hundreds of boxes of ammunition. No traditional supply convoy could have done this in such a short time, under fire, and without creating a deadly traffic jam on the bank. But DUKW did. He climbed the eastern bank like someone leaving a ferry and entering a country road. And when he reached the landing point, his mission was not over. He received a new load, turned on his own axis and returned to get more. It was closed-loop logistics, operating in the middle of the combat zone. The psychological impact was also immediate. German civilians and soldiers reported seeing trucks coming out of the water in columns. The impossible had ceased to be symbolic. Now it was mechanical, repetitive, programmed. A defense engineer interrogated by the British stated, "I was trained to calculate the position of a pontoon bridge, not to understand how they put an army inside the river." The crossing was not heroic. It was functional. It was not bloody. It was silent. The biggest weapon there wasn't the cannon, it was the stopwatch. By 3 a.m., while part of the German defenses were still waiting for signs of construction on the banks, the 305th Infantry Regiment had already taken the village of Wallach, 2 miles inside Germany. The speed of the operation destroyed not only German tactical planning, but the morale of its officers. The Rhine had been desecrated. The final barrier, crossed not by cavalry, nor by engineers, but by drivers. It was the symbolic collapse of an entire doctrine. But the DUKWs did not operate alone. Behind each crossing was a network of coordination, light engineering, mobile radios, medical units, and continuous supply. American logistics didn't just work. It moved forward with the troops. The next part will reveal how, in the first 24 hours after the operation began, the Americans made more than 5,000 crossings, creating a floating corridor that the Reich had no way of containing. Because what started with ducks crossing the river, it became a tsunami of supplies. When the sun rose on March 24, 1945, German military doctrine was officially obsolete. The lines of defense built along the Rhine were overcome not with brute force, but with logistical fluidity. The Allies did not cross. They emerged. Instead of a consolidated bridgehead, there were multiple pockets of mechanized infantry up to 10 kilometers from the east bank, supported by supplies, mortars, and radios, all carried by DUKWs that drifted in and out of the water as if the river were just another how. The reports of the first 12 hours are unanimous in one respect. There was no breaking point. There was no mass offensive. The attack was invisible, dispersed, constant. German artillery positioned to crush bridge buildings and tank columns fired into the void. Radio operators with no fixed coordinates reported moving targets that never repeated. A conventional crossing has phases: surveying, installation, occupation, advance. The crossing of the Rhine had no phases. She had flow. In numbers, the shock was even greater. In just 24 hours, the Americans made more than 5,000 crossings with DUKWs, transporting 15,000 troops, 3,000 tons of supplies, and 1,200 light vehicles, all without wasting time building a single bridge. For comparison, in the same period, Germany was able to move less than 300 tons of supplies between retreating units across the Western Front. American production of support and logistics vehicles was 10 times greater than German at that point in the war. And this disparity was not just numerical, it was doctrinal. Germany was betting on the decisive attack, on the surgical use of elite forces. The United States bet on the power of repetition, on continuous delivery, on silent saturation. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because in this crossing, she won before the first shot. With the rupture of the defense model came strategic disorientation. German units began to be surrounded without understanding where the attacks were coming from. Officials reported U.S. troops appearing in forests, villages, and roads that, hours earlier, were in safe territory. Heavy artillery was moved late without updated intelligence, firing blindly. The armored reserves waiting for the 48-hour window to counterattack found no targets. They found entire zones already under Allied control. A company commander, questioned after the surrender, summed up the mood. They crossed without bridges, without barges. Drove. It's a mechanical miracle or a nightmare. The psychological factor, more than the physical one, was the one that first collapsed. Soldiers report surrendering simply because they did not understand how the enemy had appeared behind them. There was no visible siege. There was invisible displacement. The Wehrmacht's doctrinal certainty that the crossing would require days of preparation and expose the Allies to counterattack disintegrated in the face of amphibious trucks operating with the precision of an industrial conveyor. The German war machine was waiting for a military act. It received a logistical process. and I didn't know how to react. But as the DUKWs moved forward as amphibious swarms, there was an even bigger cog at work behind the scenes. Because to keep up with that pace, a fueling system was needed that operated in real time, and with enough redundancy to make every DUKW disposable, but every cargo essential. The next part reveals how the Americans created this invisible network of support, and why, when the crossing of the Rhine began, the most important thing was already ready: automatic frontline refueling. Throughout March 24th, as the American columns advanced along the east bank of the Rhine, the real force behind the crossing revealed its quietest and most devastating face: logistics. With the continued flow of DUKWs, the Rhine had ceased to be a geographical obstacle. It had become a liquid highway, invisible but constant. It wasn't just an army cruising. It was a supply chain, mechanized and in full operation, which renewed itself every hour. At each crossing, a new batch of ammunition, fuel, feed, medicines, and spare parts was delivered directly to the front line. The return of these vehicles, in turn, carried wounded, prisoners, reports, and damaged armaments. The back and forth never stopped. The war had turned into a logistical flow, and the DUKW was the main artery. Soldiers of the 89th and 102nd Infantry Divisions, which crossed the Rhine in the first wave, described scenes that bordered on logistical surrealism. In later accounts, many highlighted the exact moment when they realized they were in another kind of war. We arrived on the other side around 3:30 a.m. There was still sporadic fire, but at 5 a.m., someone delivered hot coffee and hard-boiled eggs. They had come in a DUKW. It didn't feel like war. It felt like organization. In previous operations, this kind of logistical comfort took days to reach the advanced troops. On the Rhine, he arrived in a matter of hours. The front line received fuel even before consuming the current fuel. Machine guns were fed new tape before the old ones ran out. Wounded people were evacuated in less than 30 minutes. And when a part was requested, it arrived in the next wave of DUKWs, not by miracle, but by programming. The American system was not only robust, it was adaptive. Each DUKW company operated its own maintenance detachment, a communications platoon, and a supply operator. They followed tables synchronized with the infantry companies and coordinated charges as needed by the front. There was redundancy at all levels. If one DUKW was lost, two others took its route. If one landing point was bombed, another was activated 800 meters away. There were no bottlenecks. And, more importantly, there was no dependence on fixed infrastructure. What German doctrine had hoped for most, the opportunity to disrupt the Allied flow by destroying bridges, simply no longer existed. The bridges were now swimming. On the German side, the perplexity intensified. Reports from the 25th Corps show that even after 36 hours of American operation, tactical maps still marked the Rhine as the line of contention. The targets for the artillery remained fixed at conventional crossing points. Entire batteries were moved to places where floating bridges were supposed to be erected, and which remained empty. Meanwhile, the DUKWs crossed the river hundreds of times an hour, in alternating locations, completely ignoring expectations of direct contact. The enemy was positioned to fight structures, and the Americans had eliminated them all. This new paradigm has done more than confuse. He broke morals. The absence of bridges to destroy, convoys to ambush, and fixed targets to attack turned the war into an exercise in impotence. A German radio operator wrote in his campaign notebook, "It's like trying to shoot into fog. They appear, disappear, reappear. There is no sound of construction. There is no screaming. Just the noise of water and engines in the distance." The efficiency of the DUKWs in transporting supplies, clockwork accuracy, forced German commanders to a bitter conclusion. It was not just about military superiority. It was a war system that operated in another dimension, and that dimension included the human element. Field doctors, radio operators, cooks, mechanics all advanced along with the front, integrated into the flow of the DUKWs. It was an operation where the rear moved with the vanguard, an unprecedented fusion of logistics and combat. The result? An army that never stopped, that he didn't need a break to refuel, that he didn't need to retreat to reorganize, and that above all offered the enemy no opportunity to breathe. The doctrine of rapid rupture had become obsolete. The rupture was now constant. By the end of the second day of the crossing, the Allies were in control of a 30-kilometer deep zone on the east bank, with fully operational supply lines and full air coverage. Germany, for its part, was paralyzed. Their tactical reserves awaited an enemy who had already passed. Their artillery sought bridges that would never be built, and its commanders asked for reinforcements to defend a territory that, logistically, was already lost. The crossing of the Rhine was not just the crossing of a river, it was the overcoming of a concept. But there was an even more surprising component behind this operation. Because while the DUKWs were crossing the Rhine every minute, other American units were crossing, in absolute silence. The next part will reveal an even more audacious maneuver: the coordinated air and river crossing with paratroopers and floating pontoons that would extend the range of the breakthrough and turn the German rear into an open-air prison camp. On the morning of March 24, 1945, while the first DUKWs were still traveling down the Rhine carrying ammunition and soldiers, another front of the operation unfolded through the sky: Operation Varsity. More than 16,000 American and British paratroopers, launched from 2,500 planes and gliders, descended on the German rear at Hammenkelln and Wesel. The mission, to cut the lines of retreat and prevent reinforcements in the eastern sector of the Rhine. But unlike previous airborne operations such as Arnhem, where paratroopers were isolated and out of supplies, this time there was a key difference. The DUKWs were coming close behind, not as emergency relief, but as part of the plan. While the paratroopers were fighting their first engagements in the fields and forests of the Rhineland, the amphibious vehicles were already sailing to established footholds on the banks of the interior canals, transporting light ammunition, long-range radios, food, and medical supplies directly to the landing zones. For the first time on a large scale, the doctrine of simultaneous operations was consolidated. Logistics advanced along with the attack, without having to wait for local victories, bridges, or safe clearings. The DUKW had become the invisible link between the realms of tactics and strategy. On American maps, each group of paratroopers received a mobile logistics corridor, drawn between the rivers and canals of the region. The function of the DUKWs was to supply these units independently of the main axis of the offensive. In other words, what was once a jump and risk, isolated, vulnerable, reliant on rescue, became part of a perfectly synchronized pincer operation. For each airborne battalion, 3 or 4 DUKWs played the role of floating rearguard, supplying the positions with speed unthinkable until then. And because each vehicle was amphibious, it didn't rely on bridges, roads, or secure bridgeheads. It was enough to have navigable water. Traditional German doctrine, which saw rivers as walls, now watched Americans use them as logistical tunnels. Operation Varsity was, technically, a leap into the future, not just because of the number of troops involved, but because of the coordination between the land, air, and river domains. And at the center of this cog was the DUKW. No armor, no cannon, but with the unique ability to carry the war forward with constancy. In later testimonies, American paratroopers recounted their astonishment at receiving, within hours of landing, not only reinforced ammunition, but hot food and new radios, brought in DUKWs that had sailed from the West Bank, crossing the Rhine and the inner canals as if following an urban path, a living, intelligent, autonomous logistics. For the Germans, the presence of these vehicles inside newly landed areas was a tactical enigma. A general of the 1st Paratrooper Division, questioned after the surrender, said, "We have never seen this. They jumped out of the sky, and suddenly there were trucks coming from the water. We didn't know where the rear was anymore." The rupture was more than physical. It was temporal. The classic cycle of the offensive, crossing, consolidating, advancing, was reduced to a simultaneous sequence. While the Germans were biding for the time needed to mount a counter-offensive after the initial shock, the Americans were already 3 steps ahead. The DUKWs eliminated the logistic gap. The ammunition arrived with the 2nd platoon, radios with the 3rd, and the medical supplies before the first wounded person was evacuated. The American war began to operate in real time, and this dismantled the enemy response axis. From the German point of view, the effect was paralyzing. How to react to an enemy that has already reorganized itself before its first move. How to move reserves if the enemy advance is already supplied 20 kilometers from the initial line. The Wehrmacht, shaped to react to predictable patterns, now faced an enemy that operated out of step. The war was no longer a sequence, it became simultaneity. The DUKWs, by integrating these distinct fronts, water, land, and air, fulfilled a function that few vehicles in military history have ever performed. They eliminated the dependence on phasing. An American commander summed up the concept in a telling phrase, "We don't wait for the right moment. We carry it with us." This phrase, recorded in the First Army Report, defines not only the function of the DUKW, but the complete transformation of American operational doctrine in 1945. And it is at this point that the operation crosses an even deeper strategic threshold, because the logistical efficiency generated by the DUKWs not only amplified the offensive, she began to capture what was previously impossible: time. The next installment reveals how, in just 72 hours after the crossing, the U.S. force would collapse 3 lines of defense and put more than 30,000 Axis troops in a position to surrender, all without ever building a bridge. Since the time of the First World War, German defense doctrine had enshrined a principle: every major offensive crossing should be consolidated in a bridgehead, a fixed, limited point where the enemy would be most vulnerable, concentrating men and resources in a narrow space. It was there that the Wehrmacht's reaction force was preparing to crush the offensive. This logic, taught for generations, repeated in manuals and practiced in exercises, shaped the entire defense structure of the east bank of the Rhine in 1945. German strategists did not expect to prevent the crossing. They hoped to contain and annihilate the advance within a defined zone. But when the first DUKW entered the water and did not stop, this doctrine began to die. And in less than 72 hours, she was already tactical archaeology, because the Americans did not create a beachhead. They created dozens, mobile, parallel, and temporary. It was like facing a formless enemy, an army that did not concentrate its strength, spread it out, that he didn't wait to regroup, he flowed. Each DUKW was a vector of penetration, and each crossing opened up a new pressure point that didn't exist 5 minutes before. The Wehrmacht maps, found after the offensive, reveal the doctrinal collapse in real time. The recorded crossing positions were corrected every 6 hours, and even then they were always out of date. A map of March 24th, signed by the command of the German First Army, showed only 2 points of supposed American beachhead, while in practice there were already 5 simultaneous operating zones, covering a radius of 30 kilometers. Radio operators reported the same confusion: incessant requests for precise location of crossing points, which could never be confirmed. An intercepted report from the 47th Army Corps shows a commander asking, "Where did they cross? They are already south of Büderich, but there are no bridges, and the Rhine is still there. How did they get there?" The answer never came. The artillery, indoctrinated to fire against predictable axes, became blind. The enemy offered no fixed supply lines, nor organized columns to be attacked. The flow of the DUKWs followed variable routes, changing according to geography, resistance, or even the tide of the river itself. Each route was reprogrammed by logistics operators with maps updated in real time, using smaller canals, side accesses, swampy zones. What seemed random was actually pure calculation, but on the German side, it sounded like disorganization, and precisely because it seemed chaotic, it became impossible to predict. The collapse was not just technical, it was conceptual. The German doctrine did not provide for absolute mobility. His model was based on mass containment, on blocking what could be predicted. But the DUKWs eliminated the predictable phase. There was no bridge construction, no pause to reorganize. There was no column of tanks stuck on the bank. There was an army that arrived on the move, and stayed on the move. A general captured after the offensive, while analyzing the Allied maps, remarked bitterly, "They created a hydra. Every head we cut off, 2 appeared elsewhere." And the metaphor was accurate. The Rhine was no longer a line of defense. He had become the womb of a fluid enemy, a vector of expansion, not containment. The bridgehead logic has been replaced by the logic of continuous dispersion. Each American advance created its own logistics corridor, without having to go back or wait for consolidation. It was as if the attack came from all sides, because, in essence, it did. The crossing operation became, with the DUKWs, a continuous act of territorial multiplication. The enemy was no longer a point to be repelled. It was a process, and this process had an internal clock. Every hour, New soldiers, supplies, and parts were added to the equation. Each DUKW was more than transportation. He was a multiplier. Each completed route represented more ammunition in the hands of a patrol, more fuel for an armored vehicle, more evacuations made. And none of these elements were centralized. When the rear moves at the same speed as the front line, there is no zone of vulnerability. There is no moment to breathe. The front becomes an entire field, and the enemy, disoriented, does not know where to aim. German soldiers felt this before the generals. Accounts of prisoners collected by British forces show a repetition of phrases such as, "They were everywhere. There was no front. They came from where there was no road." Many surrendered not for lack of ammunition, but for lack of sense in the resistance. When the logic of defense disappears, morality follows with it, and by the time the generals finally grasped the new paradigm, it was too late. The Rhine was already behind them, and the DUKWs were still arriving. But the collapse of the doctrine was not the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, where logistical speed dictated the pace of territorial destruction. The next part reveals how, from this breakthrough, the Americans began a lateral expansion, cutting German lines of communication, encircling entire divisions and creating in less than 3 days the largest encirclement trap since Stalingrad. The cruelest irony of the Rhine crossing was not only in the collapse of the defenses, nor in the invisibility of the American logistical routes. She was in Germany's own technical mirror. Since 1940, German engineers had developed a sophisticated amphibious vehicle designed for river and lake crossing operations, the Landwasserschlepper, or LWS. With light armor, propeller propulsion, retractable tracks, and heavy-duty traction capability, the LWS was technically superior to the DUKW in almost every way. It could tow pontoons, land troops, and operate in swampy zones. In tests, it surpassed the DUKW in load capacity and mobility in unstable terrain. But the LWS had a fatal flaw. It was rare. Only 100 units were produced over the course of the entire war. A vehicle that, in theory, could have transformed the German river defense doctrine, it was shelved, ignored, sabotaged by a vision of war based on artisanal excellence, not on a practical scale. Germany, obsessed with perfect machines, failed to understand that in 1945 victory would come not from the ideal peace, but from reliable repetition. While the Germans spent months tuning prototypes to millimeters of precision, the Americans delivered 100 DUKWs a day to General Motors plants, each with simple maintenance instructions and interchangeable parts. In tests, an LWS could tow 10 tons with stability, a DUKW maximum 2.5 tons. But the battlefield was not a laboratory, and the crossing of the Rhine was not decided by which machine was more advanced. It was decided by which one was present. And there they were, 21,000 DUKWs produced between 1942 and 1945, operating in 5 different theaters of war, with thousands in the field at the exact moment of the crossing. The LWS, in turn, had been sent to static fronts for isolated missions, or abandoned. The enemy had the idea, but he despised the concept. This technical, or ideological, decision reveals much more than industrial priorities. It exposes a difference in philosophy. While the United States embraced mass production as a form of military doctrine, creating standardized solutions to complex problems, Germany remained stuck in an aristocratic view of war, where every weapon was a work of engineering and every vehicle a piece of art. But all-out war does not forgive aesthetics. It rewards scale, and the DUKWs, with their makeshift look, Spartan cockpit, exposed wheels, and simple steel hull, embodied this philosophy of brutal effectiveness. Each was designed to survive the mission, not to last the entire war. There was no time for beauty. There was an urgency to win. In an emblematic moment, documents captured from a German armaments factory listed 12 prototype amphibious vehicles in development until March 1945. All of them with superior performance of the DUKW in isolated parameters, but none of them in serial production. In contrast, the Americans had already created field repair kits for DUKWs, illustrated manuals for drivers, and simplified training for infantrymen. In practical terms, an American truck driver could operate a DUKW after 4 days of basic training. It was not necessary to understand marine engineering. It was enough to follow the manual and obey the rhythm of the operation. And this pace was fatal for the Germans. Within just 72 hours of the crossing began, the Americans had already encircled 3 enemy divisions on the east bank, cutting off the retreat routes and fanning down the flanks. The breaking force was not just tactical, it was volumetric. Each DUKW crossing the Rhine was not just a force vector, it was a repeater, a multiplier, and above all a reminder that the war had changed its logic. The Germans still designed tanks as if they were parade pieces. The Americans designed trucks as if they were ammunition. Here is a fact that German analysts completely ignored. In 1944, the United States produced 640,000 military trucks of all types. Germany, less than 90,000. This difference in scale, almost 7 times greater, was reflected in everything: maintenance, transportation, evacuation, advancement. And when applied to the river environment, it made the crossing of the Rhine a matter of time and repetition, not a miracle. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments, absolute power, because that's what we're talking about, the transformation of industry into a weapon. The final irony is bitter. The Landwasserschlepper, the one that could have made a difference, was last seen bogged down on the banks of the Oder, abandoned, out of fuel. A brilliant project, sabotaged by its own grandeur. Meanwhile, the DUKWs continued to cross, taking new platoons across the Rhine. No pause, no glory, no beauty, just function. But the crossing did not stop at the bank, because while the Germans were trying to reorganize their lines, the DUKWs were already operating inside cities, crossing urban canals, connecting battalions separated by ruins and destroyed bridges. The next part reveals this second phase of the crossing, the transformation of the DUKW from a tactical vehicle into an occupying force, fueling the encirclement that would dismantle the entire German rear in the Rhineland. As soldiers crossed the Rhine in smoke and mud-soaked DUKWs, the true origin of this crossing was not at the front, but thousands of miles away, in Pontiac, Michigan. There, behind windows fogged up by welding, operated the invisible heroes of this war. Civilian workers, men and women, many of them without ever having seen a European river, but directly responsible for its crossing. They did not wear steel helmets or carry rifles, but commanded an assembly line that functioned as the pulse of the American war. Every DUKW that crossed the Rhine began there, on a winch, on a press, on a bolt tightened by hands that knew that every mistake could cost a life. There was no glamour in that routine. There was repetition, noise, and urgency. The workers knew that they were not just building trucks, but feeding the very idea of victory. The process was brutal in efficiency. A DUKW could be assembled in less than 2 days. Its components came from several factories throughout the United States. Engines shared with other models of military trucks, standardized tires, cabins made of common plates without refined curves. The focus was only one: mass functionality. The philosophy was simple and powerful. While the Third Reich bet on superweapons and tanks with precision transmissions, the Americans chose simple engines that any rural mechanic knew how to repair. While the Germans designed armored vehicles as museum relics, the Americans made DUKWs as if they were serial toys, each one the same as the last, each ready to be replaced, disassembled, repurposed. The reports of the time reveal the awareness of this mission. Sarah Whitaker, a 32-year-old assembly line worker at General Motors, wrote in her diary, "I don't know where these trucks are going, but I know that the faster I weld, the faster someone comes home." This kind of collective consciousness was America's true secret weapon, not just mass production, but the emotional mobilization behind it. The DUKW, in its clumsy appearance, was the end product of a human chain linking Detroit to Nijmegen, Ohio to Duisburg, Pontiac to Remagen. Each fender that was not unique, each painting without whimsy, each poorly finished sheet hid a devastating truth. The war would not be won with perfection, but with quantity. And this was exactly what Germany did not understand. While waiting for the next miracle weapon, the DUKWs crossed the Rhine as if the impossible was just a logistical routine. The technical comparison between a DUKW and a German Panther tank was almost offensive. In direct combat, the DUKW would be destroyed in seconds. But war is not only about direct combat. It is made of range, refueling, replenishment speed, and in this, the DUKW was unbeatable, because for every carefully assembled German armored vehicle, the Americans delivered 10 amphibious vehicles, ready to cross rivers, feed fronts, evacuate wounded, and transport ammunition without ever stopping. Statistics prove this industrial abyss. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 21,000 DUKWs were produced, and of those, more than 14,000 were sent to the European theater. Meanwhile, Germany, suffocated by bombing, lack of raw materials, and internal command disputes, produced fewer than 1,000 amphibious vehicles in the same period, most of them without standardization and with non-interchangeable parts. The war of machines was won before the engines were started. In 1943, an estimate by the U.S. War Department indicated that 64% of the production of a DUKW could be made with parts already existing in other Army vehicles. This meant that maintenance was immediate, replacement was cheap, and spare parts logistics were as efficient as the troop transport itself. It was a replacement war, of persistence, and the DUKW was the visible tip of an invisible system, a system made up of workers who never left their cities but who shaped the fate of Europe with welds, nuts, and factory schedules. And there is something even more symbolic. In 1944, the Germans were betting on projects such as the Maus, a 188-ton supertank powered by a hybrid engine with impenetrable armor and enormous cannons. Only 2 prototypes were completed. None entered combat. Meanwhile, that same week, American factories completed production of 186 DUKWs, one every 55 minutes. If you are impressed by this comparison, write in the comments, "Shocking data," because this sums up the contrast between technical delirium and industrial reality. The war was won with 6 repeated screws, not with 60,000 failed designs. The DUKW, in the end, was not a vehicle. It was a materialized idea that victory would not come from the perfect machine, but from the sufficient machine. A machine made up of millions of anonymous hands united by a simple goal, to get your soldiers through to the end of the war and bring them back. But DUKW still had one more role to play, for by crossing the Rhine, he did not just pierce the German defense. He paved the way for a supply network that would invade not only the rivers, but the destroyed cities, valleys, and roads of the Rhineland. The next part reveals how this vehicle continued its march, turning crossing into occupation, and occupation into final collapse. 3 days after the first DUKWs crossed the Rhine under intense fire, something changed. What was once a war corridor became, almost imperceptibly, a conduit of aid. The columns carrying ammunition began to bring in food. The vehicles that had taken platoons to the front line now returned with wounded prisoners, and increasingly, malnourished, disoriented, collapsed German civilians. The Americans did not stop, but they changed loads. The same engine that drove the rupture of the eastern line of the Rhine now brought in ruined chocolate, blankets in burnt villages, plasma in churches transformed into infirmaries. It was war, turning into reconciliation. No speeches, no treaties. Only with wheels, propellers, and American steel. The DUKWs, which had destroyed the technical pride of the Wehrmacht, became the first emblems of humanity after the destruction. Accounts collected in war diaries describe scenes that mix incredulity and relief. In a village near Wessel, a German mother of 3 received a can of condensed milk and a blanket from the hands of an African-American operator of a DUKW. She didn't speak English. He didn't speak German. But there, among the debris and mud, the symbol of war had changed shape. The DUKW, that ridiculous swimming truck, according to German intelligence, was now the bridge of survival for a population on the verge of collapse. In Duisburg, vehicles loaded with supplies crossed the Rhine in line, unescorted, guided only by scouts, feeding more than 40,000 civilians in 4 days. These were not isolated actions. They were complete logistical operations, relayed by military radios, supplied by warehouses, and integrated into the frontline supply chain. American logistics, which had been the greatest invisible force of the war, became the first visible link of reconstruction. The same battalions that had been trained to deliver mortars now delivered lunchboxes. The same boats that had carried radios and ammunition for paratroopers now delivered diapers and bread to orphans. And all this without changing the technical structure. The DUKW did not need to be transformed. because its greatest virtue was precisely that, adapting to the mission. The war shaped him, and now, peace began to redesign it. At the field hospital near Hammenkiln, an American soldier wrote in his notebook, "Today our DUKW brought 2 wounded Germans, one of them with a uniform still stained with gunpowder. My hand trembled as I helped him down. He didn't have the strength to look at me. But I had orders, evacuate and stabilize, not to kill." That was the most brutal irony of the crossing. The vehicle that destroyed the Reich frontier became the first to ignore it. What he crossed as a weapon came back as an aid. And this gesture was not propaganda. It was logistics. Cold, efficient, but inevitably human. In Essen, mobile kitchens delivered by DUKWs were used for weeks to feed hundreds of elderly people who had lost everything. An American Red Cross report describes the use of 74 DUKWs exclusively for humanitarian missions in less than 10 days after the Rhine offensive. Some still had gunshot marks. Others had dried blood on their benches. All, however, continued to function. And that continuity, that unceasing movement was the real message that Americans were conveying. We are here, and we are not going to stop. The German generals watched this with incredulity. Many prisoners refused to believe that these vehicles, which had broken through their lines with such force, were now crossing villages with boxes of soup and children's clothes. One captured colonel said, "They turned a military truck into a symbol of occupation, and then a messenger of mercy." But it was no pity. It was doctrine. A doctrine that used industry not only to win, but to reorder. If Germany had bet on marvelous weapons, the United States had bet on useful functions. And this functionality proved to be superior, even when it came to rebuilding. There was no time to wait for treaties. The supply had to go through, and the DUKWs passed. They crossed secondary rivers, urban canals, flooded roads. They took help to where ambulances would sink, to where trains would not reach. In many cases, they were the first Allied vehicles seen by populations that had never had contact with the Americans, and who, upon seeing them, did not receive fire. They received help. This moment marks the moral turning point of the Rhine crossing. Because it was not just a military operation, it was a symbolic event. The destruction of a doctrine of war based on aesthetics and hierarchy, replaced by a driving force made of screws, humanity, and planning. The crossing had been won by engineering, but peace began to be written by the same tool. But the DUKW's role was not yet over. For while some were bringing humanitarian aid, others were already preparing for the latest tactical mission, to use Germany's internal rivers as corridors for expansion. The next part reveals how, even with the Rhine line outdated, the Americans continued to use the DUKW as a weapon of urban penetration, taking the war into the fortress cities, where the Reich still believed it could resist. After the crossing of the Rhine, when the dust settled and the maps changed color, another war began, that of explanations. Generals captured, officers interrogated, strategists defeated, all now forced to face the question that had hovered over their trenches. How was the impassable bridged? Among the piles of reports collected by Allied intelligence, there was an almost pathetic constant. The name DUKW appeared repeatedly, not as a technical curiosity, but as an emblem of doctrinal failure. In April 1945, General Walter Model himself, then a prisoner and still trying to maintain the commander's composure, was direct. "We did not consider it feasible to cross light armored vehicles without a bridge. If they passed, it was because they didn't need our rules." That's exactly what the Americans did. They ignored the rules. For German doctrine, rivers were stopping lines. They were treated as liquid trenches, where the enemy had to slow down, regroup, expose himself. Throughout the war, the Wehrmacht trained its units to crush beachheads before they became threats. But the DUKW did not create a bridgehead. He just moved forward, without waiting, without settling down. The American logistics cycle, operating on the basis of synchronization, eliminated the notion of static, and this collapsed the very vocabulary of German defense. An internal report of the 15th Army captured in March indicated with frustration that the enemy does not establish a position of front. He just moves, and our fire finds it too late. The most bitter lesson recorded by analysts such as Franz Halder was clear. The Reich was defeated not by the absolute number of tanks, nor by the number of divisions, but by the refusal to accept that the war had turned into something else. The Americans did not impose a new front. They imposed a new paradigm. And when he arrived, the German defensive lines, designed by military engineers and reinforced for weeks, looked like archaeological reliefs in front of the liquid mobility of the DUKW. The interrogations conducted by Schaff revealed a mixture of technical frustration and intellectual paralysis. At various times, officers admitted to seeing reports of light amphibious vehicles in the landings from Italy and Normandy. But German doctrine classified them as coastal support, never as offensive river vectors, a categorization that would cost hundreds of lives in cities lost in a matter of days. More than an error of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. And this failure is perhaps the most symbolic element of this whole crossing, because while Germany invested in effect weapons, the United States bet on functional solutions. The DUKW did not impress in individual tests but operated where it was needed, when it was needed, and at volumes that the German technical mind considered excessive. Excess, by the way, was the American language of victory. Excess of production, of reach, of interoperability. And that's what DUKW stood for. Not an extraordinary vehicle, but the materialization of a doctrine that did not need to ask permission from the field, only from the logistical calendar. It is ironic and perhaps painfully symbolic that the Germans themselves developed amphibious vehicles like the Landwasserschlepper even before the Americans. But its use was limited, its production reduced, and its application strictly subordinated to defensive scenarios. The DUKW, on the contrary, was conceived as a tool of initiative, and this conceptual difference made all the strategic difference. If you are enjoying unraveling these historical ironies and believe that a well-told story requires research and precision, enjoy this video and subscribe. Your support allows these details not to be lost, and that every lesson, even the most bitter, is revealed as it should be. In its final days, the Wehrmacht was no longer fighting a visible enemy, but a logic that had already overtaken its trenches and maps. A German colonel, upon being informed that the Americans had transported more than 1,000 tons of supplies a day, using DUKWs on the outskirts of Dusseldorf, replied with a dry laugh, "Then it was no longer a war, it was a system." This phrase captured what so many had tried to understand. It was no longer about cannons. It was about flow, about rhythm, about the ability to transform logistics into a weapon, into speed, into a constant presence. And the DUKW was the ultimate symbol of that. He crossed, retreated, reappeared. His strength was not attack but permanence. It was the vehicle that fed the advance and made it irreversible. And by the time the Wehrmacht finally understood this, it was too late. For by ignoring the enemy's ability to adapt, the Germans have not only lost a battle, they have lost the war of imagination. And that, as the post-war reports show, was the most definitive defeat. But there is still a detail that few know. In April 1945, one of the American amphibious engineering units wrote an internal report proposing the tactical use of the DUKW in urban operations. The idea seemed absurd. Trucks swimming in bombed streets? But it was no more absurd than crossing the Rhine without bridges. And that's exactly what happened. In the next part, we will look at how DUKWs were used to penetrate flooded urban areas, using the very collapse of German infrastructure as a gateway to the last strongholds of the Reich. The crossing of the Rhine with the DUKWs was not just a bold maneuver, it was the beginning of a domino effect that no strategic Wehrmacht simulation had predicted. In a matter of days, what was once an organized front turned into a dispersal camp. The defense lines collapsed not by brute force but by lack of time. Cities that were supposed to hold out for weeks fell without firing a shot. Entire German units, realizing that the Americans were already in their rear, without even having crossed the bridges, abandoned their positions. In Wesel, surrender was negotiated over the radio even before a direct confrontation. In Dusseldorf, local officers broke off communications with the High Command and hoisted white flags when they noticed that Allied convoys were landing supplies behind their lines. And the most symbolic, in Magdeburg, where a prolonged siege was expected, German troops opened the city's industrial gates and let the Americans in, with DUKWs crossing urban canals, flooded streets, as if the barriers had become roads. What Reich strategists did not calculate was the viral nature of mobile logistics. The DUKW wasn't just a carrier, it was a vector of collapse. Where he arrived, he supplied. Where it supplied, it stabilized. Where it stabilized, it accelerated. And where it accelerated, it anticipated the fall. Reports from the Allied General Staff indicate that the logistical crossing provided by the DUKWs brought forward the end of the campaign in the West by 3 weeks. 3 weeks. In wartime, this represents thousands of lives, hundreds of cities spared, and most critically, dozens of factories and captured infrastructure intact. Because the speed imposed by the DUKWs prevented the Germans from enforcing their policy of total destruction and retreat. In Essen, Krupp's facilities have been preserved. In Wuppertal, the railroad tracks were taken before they could be mined. The Americans did not give them time. They arrived by swimming while the German engineers were still searching for dynamite. The Rhine crossing broke more than one river line. It broke the rhythm, and without rhythm, collapse was inevitable. The layered defense doctrine, so rehearsed and meticulously prepared, simply could not respond to an enemy who ignored the steps. The classic phases of the war, approach, penetration, beachhead enlargement, exploration, were condensed into one, continuous advance. And what sustained this advance was not a new tank nor a secret weapon. It was a 2-axle truck, 6-cylinder engine, rear propeller, with a steel hull molded in an assembly line. It was the DUKW, powered by diesel fuel, maintained by interchangeable parts, operated by trained drivers in makeshift camps on the banks of Europe's forgotten rivers. The Wehrmacht, realizing that its last symbolic barrier had been converted into a supply route, began to dissolve from within. The German radios, intercepted in the following weeks, revealed a tone of resignation. An operator in front of Kassel asked, "Should we hold position or wait for them to appear from behind, as in Cologne?" The question was no longer whether the enemy would come from, but where it would come from. For the Rhine, once the historic trench of the fatherland, had been conquered not by bridges but by planning. The defeat now was mental, and perhaps this was the greatest achievement of the American logistics doctrine. It won without requiring destruction. He captured it without bombardment. He entered without announcing it. A vehicle designed for coastal landings was now defining the outcome of a continent, and he did it with the precision of an industrial gear, a gear that turned incessantly, carrying supplies, evacuating the wounded, carrying radios, moving the war forward, without ever having to stop. The Reich, which bet on clashes of force and fixed lines, did not understand the nature of this movement. And that's why he didn't understand the war that was going on. But there was still a deeper consequence, because what was broken on the Rhine was not just a tactical line. It was the belief that the war was sustained only by numbers of soldiers and volume of fire. From that moment on, it was clear that whoever controlled the flow controlled the outcome. And the DUKW, with its simple hull and its singular mission, had become the symbol of this new kind of force, a silent, repetitive, efficient force that he did not win by impact but by inevitability. And if the crossing of the Rhine seemed the pinnacle of its function, the next few moves would show that there was still more. Because as the Allied armies advanced into the heart of the Reich, a new logistical order began to take shape, one that would use the DUKW not just to win, but to manage. The next part will reveal how, behind the scenes of the offensive, the Allied commands began to redesign the future of the occupation and reconstruction of Germany, based on the liquid routes already opened by these machines. The DUKW not only helped end the war, it was one of the first vehicles to cross the bridge for the post-war period. The accounts captured after the crossing of the Rhine reveal more than data or statistics. They expose the psychological state of the Wehrmacht in the face of an enemy that defied all expectations. Letters from officers, soldiers' diaries, and post-war interviews capture a mixture of incredulity, fear, and resignation. A young lieutenant of the 338th Division wrote in his diary, "We shot them, but more came. Always more. How do we stop an army that turns rivers into roads?" This was not a poetic exaggeration, but a tactical observation. German doctrine had predicted weeks of structured combat, vulnerable crossing points, beachheads to be crushed, and concentrated reinforcements. But the DUKW, with its ability to cross the Rhine continuously, broke through all these predictions. Every vehicle that went up the eastern bank carried infantry, ammunition, medical supplies, and heavy equipment, a concrete manifestation of American industrial superiority. There were no breaks, there were no critical vulnerabilities. And where the defenders expected congestion, they found steady flow. The presence of the DUKW made the most meticulous defense plans obsolete. German officers, as they reviewed maps of artillery positions and reconnaissance reports, realized that zones that were supposed to be strong points were being bypassed. A German major confessed in interrogation, "We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. We knew it was over." The phrase encapsulates the irony of the situation. Germany had invested years in sophisticated doctrines, precision engineering, and imposing fortifications, but it did not anticipate that the enemy could bypass these barriers with machines deemed irrelevant. Each DUKW not only fulfilled its function, but multiplied the psychological confusion, creating the feeling that the rules of war had changed overnight. The impact was not limited to the troops. German civilians witnessed surreal scenes. Trucks emerging from the river laden with soldiers, weapons, and supplies, as the defensive lines crumbled silently, as if resistance had never existed. Frau Elizabeth Becker, a resident of Wessel, described, "We heard the bang of artillery on March 23rd and expected weeks of fighting. On March 26th, American trucks passed by our house, still wet from the crossing." This realization turned the Rhine, considered Germany's mythical barrier, into a symbol of inevitable collapse. It wasn't just a physical defeat, it was a strategic humiliation that no plan or fortification could remedy. Captured German documents reinforce this narrative. The final report of the General Staff of the 15th Division, dated March 27th, indicated a clear inability to understand the phenomenon. The enemy does not establish bridgeheads, does not build bridges. He just appears everywhere at once. Our fire is useless. The words reflect not only surprise but the impossibility of reacting. The Wehrmacht had built 3,000 bunkers, mobilized 200,000 civilians, positioned tanks and artillery at strategic points. But these preparations proved irrelevant in the face of industrial production that prioritized volume and speed over individual perfection. American victory did not depend on isolated tactical superiority. It depended on a logistical philosophy that turned every river into a road and every obstacle into an opportunity. The psychological effects were profound. German soldiers, accustomed to discipline and predictability, faced not only material loss but a devastating moral shock. Many accounts indicate mass surrenders simply because they did not understand how the Allies had penetrated their lines. At Wesel, officers reported units abandoning entire positions while DUKWs transported supplies directly to the points of resistance that were supposed to be isolated. The sense of inevitability dominated. If trucks could swim, then any planned barrier was, in fact, useless. The contrast with the German Landwasserschlepper only accentuated the irony. Produced in limited numbers with superior armor and refined technical capability, the LWS was an individual engineering prodigy, but it could not be replicated at scale. While the Wehrmacht focused its efforts on isolated excellence, the United States applied the American logic of mass production. Tens of thousands of DUKWs, manufactured quickly, operated by soldiers of minimal training, each enough to create devastating cumulative effect. The analysis of one captured officer summed up the German perception. They did not surpass us in skill. They surpassed us in volume, in ability to do, in continuous presence. The letters and interviews further show that the impact of the DUKWs went beyond the immediate battlefield. Cities began to negotiate preemptive surrenders, understanding that resistance was futile in the face of a steady flow of supplies and troops. Officers who still held out some hope of a counterattack reported in a diary that there was no fixed target. The enemies are at every point, in places that our doctrines do not contemplate. Every attempt at reorganization is intercepted by continuous movement. The crossing of the Rhine not only accelerated the war, it transformed the perception of what was possible, redefining the logic of German defense. And Hans Müller's testimony sums up the final effect. "We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. We knew it was over." He wasn't exaggerating. The German inability to imagine an enemy capable of mobilizing hundreds of amphibious trucks in a coordinated manner generated not only surprise but collapse. What they called an impassable barrier had become a highway for the Allied offensive. The Rhine, protected by millennia of doctrine and geography, lost its strategic significance in a matter of hours, replaced by American industrial efficiency. And it is at this point that the narrative prepares for the next phase. because the successful crossing not only marked the end of direct resistance on the bank of the Rhine, but also paved the way for subsequent operations that would consolidate the Allied victory and hasten the end of the Reich. In the next part, we will look at how the DUKWs, continuing their logistical and tactical role, became central instruments in consolidating territories, maintaining supplies, and coordinating combined offensives that ensured that the Wehrmacht could never again react cohesively. What began as an underrated vehicle became a symbol of a war won by logistics, production, and operational imagination that the Germans never anticipated. The crossing of the Rhine with the DUKWs is more than a tactical feat or an isolated military operation. Before March 1945, Wehrmacht theorists and strategists assumed that natural barriers, fortifications, and concentration of firepower could determine the course of battles. But the DUKWs demonstrated that true power lay not just in the individual quality of weapons or the skill of the soldier, but in the ability to mobilize resources on an industrial scale and apply them with logistical precision. Every amphibious truck manufactured in Detroit, every soldier trained to operate it, every piece of supply delivered across a once impassable river was a testament to the superiority of the American model: mass production, standardization, simple maintenance, and integration between different branches of the military. Historically, the German LWS could have been considered superior in individual tests, but Germany had no way to replicate tens of thousands of units. Meanwhile, the U.S. has built 21,147 DUKWs, each enough to sustain the flow of operations on multiple fronts simultaneously, turning a millennia-old geographic obstacle into a liquid highway for its forces. The impact of this philosophy was recorded not only in operational reports, but in the perception of the enemies themselves. German officers, who had studied defensive engineering for years, recognized that this was not a failure of courage or tactics, but a failure of imagination. The Rhine, protected by 2,000 generations of military doctrine, became irrelevant when compared to American industrial efficiency. The message was clear. Wars are not won only with powerful weapons or fortified positions. They are won by the pace and constancy of production, by the ability to transform any element of the terrain into a logistical advantage. A DUKW, simple in design, became an instrument of domination because industrial strength underpinned its application, and application underpinned psychological impact on the enemy. Historians and engineers point out that this operation anticipated concepts that are now fundamental in modern military planning: operational mobility, systems redundancy, integration between land, amphibious, and airborne units, and the ability to maintain continuous supply lines without interruption. The crossing of the Rhine demonstrated that the traditional cycle of war, preparation, crossing, consolidation, reinforcement, could be condensed, accelerated, and multiplied, making war not just a clash of forces but a demonstration of organizational supremacy. The DUKW, despised by the Germans as an American product without a soul, proved that what seemed simple was actually a manifestation of industrial and strategic power. The most revolutionary element was the way in which mass production translated into tactical power. Each DUKW carried 12 soldiers and supplies equivalent to tons of equipment, repeatedly, without relying on bridges, barges, or field engineering. The natural redundancy of production meant that vehicle losses were irrelevant to overall progress. The ability to replace and maintain quickly allowed the operation to continue uninterrupted. The German lines, trained to respond to sequential attacks at specific points, were unable to react to dispersion and the constancy of the flow. Officers reported that they were unable to identify the main front of the attack, nor to anticipate where the supplies would arrive. The Rhine was not conquered, it was industrially bypassed. Contemporary military analysts emphasize that the DUKW anticipated the notion of logistics time equaling tactical time. In classical warfare, each advance depended on the completion of previous stages: crossing, consolidation, reinforcement. With the DUKWs, supplies, infantry, and means of communication advanced in parallel, allowing airborne and armored units to operate in a coordinated and continuous manner. The war became an integrated system, and the success of the Rhine crossing proved that industrialization could determine the outcome of an entire campaign in days, not weeks or months. The psychological aspect was also transformative. The Wehrmacht, realizing that its fortifications and artillery could not prevent the crossing, experienced instant demoralization. Officers later confessed that the impotence in the face of hundreds of amphibious vehicles scattered along the front was more decisive than the material loss itself. Civilians and soldiers witnessed the speed and efficiency of the process, cementing the perception of the inevitability of American victory. The DUKW thus became not only an instrument of war, but a vector of strategic and moral disintegration. The crossing of the Rhine exemplifies the transition from artisanal to industrial warfare. While Germany still relied on strict doctrines and complex vehicles produced in small quantities, the United States applied mass production and pragmatic innovation to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. The DUKW was not the most powerful weapon individually, nor the most sophisticated, but its scale and strategic application revealed that victory in the 20th century depended more on the ability to mobilize, maintain, and apply resources than on perfection alone. That lesson echoed not only at the end of World War II, but also in Cold War planning, the creation of modern amphibious forces, and the philosophy of mobilizing contemporary armies. As we move toward the conclusion of this narrative, the crossing of the Rhine stands as a symbol of a fundamental shift. Industrial supremacy redefined warfare. Each DUKW that went up the Rhine didn't just carry soldiers or supplies. It carried the proof that productive power can overcome any fortification, that the rhythm of logistics can overcome any defensive strategy, and that in modern conflict the factory is as decisive as the battlefield. In the next part, the conclusion, we will look at how this seemingly modest vehicle encapsulated strategic, industrial, and human lessons that transformed the conduct of war, cementing Allied victory, and establishing new paradigms for future generations. The Rhine, which for centuries had been treated as Germany's final barrier, fell not by artillery power or tactical genius, but by the constancy, volume, and ingenuity of American industry. Within days, the DUKWs turned a sacred river into a liquid highway, carrying soldiers, supplies, vehicles, and hope, with a regularity impossible to be challenged by German doctrines. The collapse of the Wehrmacht was not just on the physical margin, but on the mindset of officers and soldiers who had never conceived that trucks could swim, that mass production could bypass any fortification, and that logistics could dictate the pace of the war. The lesson is universal. In modern conflicts, volume, standardization, and organization can trump genius alone. The ability to maintain flow, supply, and mobility determines strategy, not just individual strength or skill. As General Alfred von Rhine admitted in captivity, we were defeated not by tanks, not by artillery, but by swimming trucks. This historical moment proves that war is not only won on the battlefield, but in the factory, in logistical planning, and in applied imagination. If you have valued this detailed analysis of the Rhine crossing, like and sign up to support the research and the search for historical truth. Comment on the most shocking data you have discovered and activate the bell so as not to miss the next devastating historical fact. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.